Mr. Speaker, as a Chicagoan, I know firsthand the terror that Trump's mass deportation agenda and Department of Homeland Security's immigration raids are having on our communities. You see, my constituents, they've been surveilled, they've been threatened, they've been tear gassed, they've been hit with pepper balls, they've been shot, they've been subjected to warrantless arrest, rammed with Department of Homeland Security vehicles, kidnapped and disappeared. And people keep asking us why DHS agents are allowed to behave this way. Why isn't Congress doing something about it? Well, let me start by saying DHS was intentionally established with an overbroad mission, and some would argue unchecked power. Yet Republicans have expanded that power with a blank check and unlimited personnel. And Trump, with his authoritarian tendencies, his power grabs, his overreach, and his willingness to shamelessly use DHS as his own force of terror, is only making visible what so many communities have already known to be true: that terrorizing is the point, violating our rights is the point, that fear is the point. You see, creating a public enemy is meant to convince Americans to sacrifice our freedoms for the promise of security. But let me be very clear. Nothing that the Department of Homeland Security is doing is making us any safer. In this moment, under Secretary Noem, under Donald Trump, DHS has become the single greatest threat to public safety. You see, DHS agents are using chemical weapons on protesters and bystanders at least 49 times across 18 incidents in Chicago and suburbs since October 1st. Bovino and CBP agents are violating court injunctions and agency rules. They're lying in court about incidents where civilians have been put in danger. The government alleged that Marimar Martinez used her car to assault and impede federal law enforcement. But then, federal prosecutors filed a motion to dismiss their own case. Why? Because while she didn't assault the agents, they did shoot her 5 times. And then they went on and they bragged about it. You see, President Trump and DHS are lying. They're acting with impunity. They're rejecting checks and balances. They're ignoring Congress and the courts. And here's my question to this House. If DHS cannot be held accountable, if we're obstructed from conducting oversight, if they are systematically undermining our civil rights and perpetrating violence in our communities, what in fact is Congress' responsibility? You see, the answer is clear. We must strip away every tool that they're using to terrorize us, starting with the taxpayer dollars that they're using to harm Americans. And so today, in our special order hour, I'm going to be yielding to my colleagues who will highlight stories of victims of Trump's enforcement overreach, discuss our ongoing work to hold the administration accountable, and uplift how we are pushing back against the abuses of this president, of Secretary Noem, and the entire administration.
Last week, I visited the Tacoma, Washington ICE detention facility to visit constituents and to conduct oversight. I wanted the opportunity to see for myself the facility, to understand what my constituents are being put through. I gave ICE their 7-day notice of my arrival as they had requested, but I knew I would get a sanitized version of the privatized prison I would be shown. But the alternative would be to drive 3 hours, and then they would turn me away. The goal was to meet with my constituents and their attorney and get a tour of the facility. When I asked about the detainees not being able to access medication, facility officials told me that the detainees often lie about the lack of access to medical care. They claimed anyone could get access to medical care that they need. However, I know of at least one of my constituents who was detained and was not able to access their heart medication he needed. He went 2 weeks without his life-saving heart medicine. Why would anybody lie about that? Their heart medicine. He had no reason to lie, but he did get it 2 weeks later when he was sent down to Texas. When I asked about the tuberculosis outbreak in the Alaska detention facility, ICE claimed the news reports got it wrong. I questioned if similar outbreaks happened in the Tacoma ICE facility, and again, flat out lies. The attorney I spoke to afterwards told me, yes, there were outbreaks in the Tacoma facility. When I asked about detainees not being able to access their attorneys, Facility officials told me, oh, there are tablets that they can access, there are lots of rooms. And when I was supposed to meet with my constituents on that same day, I was refused access to my own constituents and their attorney. So even with the full 7-day notice, the Tacoma ICE detention facility, the Department of Homeland Security, the GEO group, they couldn't get their story straight. They raised more questions than they could answer. The questions they did answer were lies, half-truths, and misleading at best. We should all be holding ICE, Homeland Security, and this administration accountable. It may start at our local or regional detention facilities, but it does not stop there. We must hold Tom Homan, Kristi Noem, and Donald Trump accountable. They must tell me why a 17-year-old U.S. citizen was arrested, traumatized, and suffered shards of glass in his eye when an ICE vigilante smashed in his driver's side window and arrested him, detained him first, and asked questions later. This is not justice. This is terror. But I have a voice. I have a voice for the people in my district. I have a voice for those who still believe in the United States is the land of opportunity, just as the Salinas family did in 1945. I will continue to conduct oversight and publicize the horrific acts of ICE. They cannot continue to operate in the shadows. We must all continue to speak out and hold those who have raised their hands and pledged their oath to the Constitution. We must hold them accountable, but they are failing miserably today. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you for your leadership.
Mr. Speaker, 80 years ago, over 120,000 Japanese individuals were stripped of their rights and forced into barbed wire camps because of the way they looked and the language they spoke. My great-grandfather, my Gigi, was one of them. He was taken from his home on Maui and imprisoned, not for anything that he had done, but for who he was. We said then, never again. Yet here we are today. Now the very sites where Japanese American families were incarcerated have been reopened. Fort Bliss, a World War II internment camp, is now the nation's largest immigrant detention center. To add insult to injury, the Trump administration is using the same law, the Alien Enemies Act, that was once used to imprison Japanese Americans to detain and fast-track deportations with zero due process rights. And while this administration insists it is targeting dangerous criminals, we know that more than 73% of those in ICE custody have no criminal convictions at all. This administration is also intentionally dismantling legal pathways and stripping people of lawful status so they can be deported, just as we saw on Kauai recently, where a raid that swept up 44 people ended with 6 Venezuelan men who were legally here seeking asylum, self-deporting after the administration revoked temporary protected status for their country. To anyone who thinks this could never happen to me, consider this. 2/3 of the Japanese imprisoned in camps were American citizens. Their children, like my grandfather, serving in the United States military in defense of a country who saw them as the enemy. Today, American citizens are also being rounded up once again, stopped and detained simply for the way they look, by officers who face no accountability. United States military veterans picked up, detained, deported. What we are witnessing is a slow, methodical erosion of citizens' rights and a cold indifference towards treating entire communities as national security threats. We are in the midst of history in the making, and history has already shown us the dangers of what this country can do when given unchecked, unfettered immigration authorities. So I ask my colleagues on all sides of the aisle, how much are we willing to tolerate before we say enough is enough? 80 years later, this nation still reflects with shame at what it did to our Japanese American families. We apologize, we vowed to learn, we vowed to do better, and we have failed. Nidoto nai, my colleagues, nidoto nai. I yield back.
Since the beginning of his second term, Donald Trump has directed the enforcement machine that is not only cruel but unconstitutional, targeting longtime residents, law-abiding visa holders, U.S. citizens, and even veterans who have fought for this country. In border communities like the one I represent in Arizona's 7th Congressional District, we see the impact of these abuses every single day. We have seen Border Patrol waiting outside of hospitals, literally arresting women after they've given birth. No due process, no regard for human rights. Last week, we saw a disturbing example near the ranching community of Arivaca. Humanitarian volunteers with No More Deaths reported that Border Patrol agents forced their way into their desert aid station known as Bird Camp without a warrant and arrested 3 migrants who were resting inside a trailer. Volunteers told agents they could not enter without a warrant. Agents left, then returned, claiming that they were in hot pursuit, even though there was no chase, no threat, no legal justification that would allow entering a protected structure. This camp has existed for decades to keep people from dying in the desert. More than 4,400 men, women, and children have died crossing the border in Arizona since 2000. The camp has been raided before, but previously with a warrant. What happened on November 23rd was different. It was lawless, intentional, and part of a broader pattern of unchecked enforcement that treats border communities as if the Constitution does not apply. Let me say this clearly. The Fourth Amendment does not disappear in southern Arizona. Due process does not disappear because someone is a migrant, and humanitarian aid is not a crime. Thank you, and I yield back to Representative Ramirez.